Hey everybody, it's Ron, and I want to tell you a story about business and how that story changed everything. So imagine that it's 1786. You sailed north from New Haven, Connecticut 2 days ago, hugging the coastline. The morning air in the New York City harbor is cold enough that you can see your breath when you speak. The tide slaps against the hull. Bits of driftwood swirl past as your small merchant vessel eases towards the dock. Below deck are barrels of flour and crates of goods bound for customers across the river in New Jersey. You never left the young United States. You never crossed an ocean. And yet, as a customs officer steps aboard with his ledger already open, it kind of feels like you have. Duty taxes are assessed under New York law. You explain that the goods aren't staying in New York, they're passing through. They were sold before you ever left Connecticut. But that doesn't matter. New York sets its own rules. New Jersey sets its own. Some states print paper money that loses value by the month. Some force creditors to accept it. Some tax their neighbors and dare them to respond. Political independence has not created economic unity. Trade, it feels less like one nation and more like 13 individual negotiations. But here's the thing. If every state writes its own commercial rules, how does a merchant plan for the future? If contracts can be ignored at a state border, who risks extending credit? And if money changes value depending on which side of a river you stand on, how does a country ever become a single market on March 16, 1751? From Business Basics, I'm Ron Trucks, and this is Business History, the daily podcast where we explain the stories that changed business forever. Every date on the calendar has a story where business reshaped the world. Today, March 16th, that story takes us to 1751, the birth of the rule maker that made markets work. By the mid-1780s, the United States had won a war against Britain, but it hadn't yet figured out how to run an economy. The Articles of Confederation, which was something a lot of us learned about in school but never really quite understood, was basically the first Constitution before they threw it out because it didn't work, and then created the new Constitution. So those Articles of Confederation, they had created a loose alliance of states. The overarching Congress could request money and it could debate policy, but it couldn't compel uniform rules across state lines. It couldn't regulate interstate commerce, and it couldn't prevent one state from undercutting another. So each state did what made sense for itself. Some passed tariff laws to protect their own merchants. New York, sitting on the region's dominant harbor, leaned heavily on custom duties for revenue. Connecticut merchants felt squeezed. New Jersey retaliated with its own measures. What began as tax policy turned into economic rivalry. At the same time, several states printed paper money to ease debt burdens at home. In some places, creditors were forced to accept currency that was already losing value. In others, contracts were enforced strictly. The rules changed depending on where you physically stood. For merchants, risk was no longer just about storms or spoiled cargo, it was about uncertainty in the rules themselves. A young Virginian named James Madison was paying attention. He believed something fundamentally was wrong. Independence had been secured, stability hadn't. And without stability, markets stall.
Imagine home. The smell of coffee, the sound of a lawnmower, the sun's warmth on your face. Free to be yourself, surrounded by love that helps you grow. This is a place to call home. That's an American dream we all deserve. But in 50% of U.S. states, you could legally be denied housing if you are LGBTQ+. Get the facts and hear real stories at lovehasnolabels.com. Brought to you by Love Has No Labels and the Ad Council.
When delegates gathered in Philadelphia in 1787 at what became the United States Constitutional Convention, they weren't just debating abstract political theories. They were responding to a system that was already visibly straining. Madison arrived prepared. He had studied confederacies that had failed in history. He had cataloged the weaknesses of the current arrangement, and he was convinced that commercial fragmentation would eventually fracture the nation itself. The solution required central authority. The proposed Constitution gave Congress the power to regulate commerce among all of the states. It restricted states from issuing their own bills of credit, and it prevented them from passing laws that impaired obligation of contracts. And it created a federal judiciary capable of enforcing those standards. These provisions did not eliminate disagreement between the states, but they changed the structure of incentives. Instead of 13 competing commercial systems, there would be one framework. Merchants could extend credit across lines with greater confidence. Investors could evaluate risk with more clarity, and trade could move without renegotiating the rules at every border. That shift wasn't dramatic in a single moment, but it was foundational.
Retirement can be scary, but only if you're not prepared. That's why AARP created thisispretirement.org. Because unless you've already retired, you're in pretirement, and you still have time to plan. Learn about retirement savings options, potential tax breaks, and how you can build savings over time. Visit thisispretirement.org for free resources to help you customize your action plan and feel the retirement fear disappear. Brought to you by AARP and the Ad Council.
I always had to be so good, no one could ignore me. Carve my path with data and drive. But some people only see who I am on paper. The paper ceiling, the limitations from degree screens to stereotypes that are holding back over 70 million stars. Workers skilled through alternative routes rather than a bachelor's degree. It's time for skills to speak for themselves. Find resources for breaking through barriers at tearthepaperceiling.org. Brought to you by Opportunity at Work and the Ad Council.
Now, it's important to understand that the ratification of the Constitution didn't immediately transform the economy. There were still recessions, still political fights, still regional tensions. But something subtle had changed. Over time, interstate trade between the states, expanded under a more predictable legal environment. Contracts could be enforced beyond local courts, and currency rules were no longer a patchwork of state experiments. The cost of doing business across state lines declined, and that predictability mattered. It encouraged capital formation. It made long-distance trade less speculative. It allowed enterprises to grow beyond their home states. Later developments, canals, railroads, national corporations, would rely on that legal infrastructure. Markets don't grow simply because people want to trade. They grow when participants believe the rules will hold. So your question right now probably is, what does this all have to do with March 16th, 1751? That was the day that James Madison was born, the man who would help shape that framework. And while his birth didn't create a national market, the ideas he championed very heavily helped make one possible. I'm Ron Trucks, and this is Business History, the podcast that finds the turning points behind the headlines. To hear more stories like this, follow us on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, YouTube, or wherever you listen. And if you're enjoying the stories, don't forget to subscribe and leave a quick review. It helps more people find the story behind the business. And if you want to actually understand business better without the fluff or the buzzwords or the MBA language, start by visiting us at businessdailypodcast.com.